The Hollowfangs mark. Kasha Winter never believed in fate, not even when the elders whispered her name like a ghost of something lost. But when she crossed the river, the water froze, the trees sighed, and the torches in the abandoned chapel lit themselves. And then he stepped from the dark, golden eyes gleaming. "You should have never left," he murmured, his voice like distant thunder. "But this time, I won't let you run." Chapter 1. The Frozen River's Omen. The late autumn air bit at Kasha Winter's cheeks, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. She pulled her worn woolen shawl tighter, the familiar weight a small comfort against the unsettling chill that had settled deep in her bones. 58 years. 58 years she'd lived, most of them far from this place, far from the whispers and the shadows that clung to the name Winter like cobwebs to an abandoned house. Yet, here she was, back in Hollow Creek, the town she'd sworn never to return to. The reason sat beside her in a battered cardboard box, her grandmother, Elsie's, ashes. Elsie, the last of the Hollow Creek Winters, had died peacefully in her sleep in a sunny Florida retirement home, a world away from the brooding forests and hushed superstitions of her birthplace. Her last request, scrawled in shaky handwriting on a faded floral postcard, was to be returned to the family plot, beside her husband, Thomas. Kasha hadn't understood it. Elsie had fled Hollow Creek with Kasha's mother, a young girl then, vowing never to look back. She'd built a new life, a normal life, deliberately scrubbing away any trace of the town's strange, unsettling history. Why return now, even in death? But a promise was a promise. And Kasha, despite the tremor of unease that vibrated through her, was a woman who kept her word. The narrow, rutted road wound its way through the dense forest, the trees skeletal and stark against the fading light. The air grew heavier, thicker, the silence broken only by the crunch of the tires on the gravel and the distant, mournful cry of a hawk. Kasha glanced at the river, the Hollow Creek itself, that snaked alongside the road. It was usually a rushing, tumbling torrent, but today it was strangely still. As she neared the old wooden bridge, the one that marked the boundary of the town proper, a shiver crawled down her spine. She slowed the car, her gaze fixed on the water. It wasn't just still. It was frozen. Solid. A sheet of ice, impossibly thick and smooth, stretched from bank to bank, despite the fact that the temperature, while chilly, was nowhere near freezing. Kasha stopped the car completely, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't right. This wasn't natural. She'd seen strange things in her youth, things her grandmother had dismissed as old wives' tales and overactive imaginations. But this was undeniable. She slowly stepped out of the car, the cold seeping into her boots. The air around the river shimmered, almost imperceptibly, like heat rising off asphalt on a summer day. But this was cold, a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the weather. As she approached the edge of the bridge, she heard it. A sigh. Not from the wind, but from the trees themselves. A collective, rustling whisper that seemed to carry her name. Kasha, her hand trembled as she reached out, hesitantly touching the frozen surface of the river. It was unnaturally cold, the ice radiating a strange energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She drew her hand back quickly, a gasp escaping her lips. Suddenly, a flicker of light caught her eye. Across the river, nestled amongst the trees, stood the old abandoned chapel. It had been derelict for as long as Kasha could remember, a crumbling stone shell of a building, a relic of a time when Hollow Creek was something more or perhaps something less. But now, the windows, which had been dark and empty just moments before, were glowing. Torches, impossibly lit, flickered within, casting an eerie, dancing light onto the surrounding trees. Kasha felt a pull, an undeniable urge to cross the bridge, to enter the chapel. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced since she was a child, a feeling she'd buried deep, along with all the other strange, unsettling memories of her early years. Fear warred with an almost magnetic attraction. She knew she should turn around, drive away, pretend she hadn't seen any of this. But she couldn't. Taking a deep, shaky breath, She started across the bridge, the wooden planks groaning under her weight. The frozen river seemed to watch her, the ice reflecting the flickering torchlight from the chapel like 1,000 watchful eyes. The sighing of the trees intensified, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Kasha Winter returned as she reached the other side. The chapel door, which had been hanging crookedly on its hinges, swung open silently, revealing a shadowy interior bathed in the warm, flickering glow of the torches. And then he stepped out. He was tall, silhouetted against the light, his figure imposing and undeniably powerful. Kasha couldn't make out his features, but she could feel his gaze, intense and unwavering, like the eyes of a predator. He moved with a fluid grace, a silent, almost spectral presence. As he drew closer, the shadows receded, revealing a face that was both strikingly handsome and deeply unsettling. His eyes, a piercing, luminous gold, seemed to glow with an inner light. His hair was dark, thick, and slightly wild, framing a face with sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw. He was dressed in clothes that seemed both ancient and timeless, dark leather trousers, a heavy woolen tunic, and a cloak that billowed around him in the non-existent breeze. He stopped a few feet from her, his golden eyes holding hers captive. A small, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips. The air crackled with an energy that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He smelled of wood smoke and pine needles, and something else, something wild and untamed. "You should have never left," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very ground she stood on. It was a voice that echoed in her memory, a voice she hadn't heard in decades, yet recognized instantly. A voice like distant thunder. Kasha's breath caught in her throat. Her mind struggled to reconcile the impossible reality before her with the logical, rational world she'd carefully constructed for herself. She wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, to deny the fear that was threatening to consume her, but the words wouldn't come. He took another step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. The smile faded, replaced by a look of longing, regret. It was impossible to tell. But this time, he continued, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of centuries, "I won't let you run." The chapel, the river, the town, it all seemed to fall back. Her entire world existed only in that gaze. Was this madness, grief, or something else entirely? Chapter 2. Shadows in the Abandoned Chapel. His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, a stark contrast to the fragile shell of normalcy Kasha had so carefully built around herself. She wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to break the spell that seemed to hold her captive. But her feet were rooted to the spot, her body betraying the frantic commands of her mind. Who are you?" She finally managed to whisper, the words raspy and weak, even to her own ears. He tilted his head slightly, a flicker of something that might have been amusement, or perhaps pity, crossing his features. "Don't you remember, Kasha? Surely, the whispers of Hollow Creek haven't faded that much." His voice, that low, resonant rumble, sent shivers down her spine. It was a voice that belonged to the shadows, to the ancient trees, to the frozen river. It was a voice that shouldn't exist in the world she knew. He took another step, closing the distance between them. She could see the details of his face now, the way the torchlight played on his high cheekbones, the intensity of his golden eyes, the faint lines around his mouth that hinted at a life lived beyond the confines of ordinary time. He was breathtakingly beautiful, in a way that was both alluring and terrifying. "I am Reese," he said, his voice softer now, almost a caress. Reese of Hollowfang. The name struck her like a physical blow. Hollowfang. The name of the legend, the myth, the boogeyman of her childhood. The creature the elders whispered about in hushed tones, the one they said protected the town, and demanded its due. The one Elsie had warned her about, even as she dismissed it as nonsense. "That's impossible," Kasha stammered, her mind reeling. "Hollowfang is just a story. A legend." Reese smiled, a slow, knowing smile that did nothing to ease her fear. "Legends often have roots in truth, Kasha. Especially in a place like Hollow Creek." He gestured towards the chapel behind him.
Come.
We have much to discuss. Kasha hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to put as much distance as possible between herself and this man, this creature. But there was something in his eyes, a deep sadness, a loneliness that mirrored her own, that held her back. And there was the undeniable pull, the feeling that she was somehow bound to this place, to this moment, to him. With a trembling breath, she followed him into the chapel. The interior was surprisingly intact, considering its age and state of disrepair. The stone walls were damp and cold, but the air was surprisingly still and warm, thanks to the torches that burned brightly in sconces along the walls. The light revealed faded frescoes depicting scenes of ancient rituals, of wolves and men, of a bond that seemed both sacred and terrifying. Dust motes danced in the golden light, creating an ethereal, almost otherworldly atmosphere. Reese led her to the altar, a massive stone slab that dominated the center of the chapel. He gestured for her to sit on a nearby wooden bench, its surface worn smooth by time and countless hands. He remained standing, his presence filling the space, his shadow stretching long and distorted on the stone floor. "You came back for Elsie," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness. Kasha nodded, clutching the cardboard box containing her grandmother's ashes. "She wanted to be buried here. With my grandfather." Reese's gaze softened. Elsie was a strong woman, but she carried a heavy burden, the burden of all the winters. "What burden?" Kasha asked, her voice stronger now, fueled by a growing sense of defiance. "What are you talking about?" Reese sighed, running a hand through his thick, dark hair. "The winters have always been different, tied to this land, to its magic, to its protector." He paused, his golden eyes locking with hers.
"To me."
Kasha stared at him, her mind struggling to grasp the implications of his words. "You're saying you're the Hollowfang? The werewolf?" The word felt ridiculous, absurd, coming from her lips. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "The bond between the winters and Hollowfang is ancient, Kasha. It goes back generations. It's a pact, a promise, a curse, some might say." "A curse?" Kasha echoed, a cold dread creeping into her heart. "A blessing and a curse," Reese corrected. "The winters have always been the keepers of the balance, the guardians of the veil between this world and another. And Hollowfang, I am the protector of that balance. But the balance has been disrupted. For years, it has been weakening. And now it's almost broken." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate urgency. "You, Kasha, are the last of the winters. The last one who can restore the balance. The last one who can fulfill the pact." Kasha felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. This was too much. Too much strangeness. Too much responsibility. Too much magic. She wanted to deny it all, to dismiss it as the ravings of a madman. But the frozen river, the self-lighting torches, the undeniable power that radiated from this man, it all pointed to a truth she could no longer ignore. "I don't understand," she whispered. "What pact? What am I supposed to do?" Reese stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "The pact requires a sacrifice, Kasha. A union. A binding." He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from hers. She could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, the strange energy that crackled between them. "A binding to you?" Kasha asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his golden eyes searching hers, a mixture of hope and desperation in their depths. "A soul bond, Kasha. A joining of our spirits, our essence. It's the only way to restore the balance, to protect Hollow Creek, to save us all." The weight of his words, the weight of the ancient chapel, the weight of her family's legacy, pressed down on her. She looked at his hand, so close to hers, and a terrifying, exhilarating thought took root in her mind. What if this was her destiny? What if, after all these years of running, of hiding, she was finally home? And could she really run from a bond already pulling at her soul? Chapter 3. Hollowfangs' haunting echo. The silence that followed his declaration was thick with unspoken implications, with the weight of centuries of tradition and the daunting prospect of a future Kasha had never imagined. A soul bond. The words echoed in her mind, both terrifying and strangely alluring. A joining of spirits, of essence. A merging with this being, this Reese of Hollowfang, who is both man and myth, protector and prisoner, perhaps, of his own ancient legacy. She looked at his hand, still hovering near hers, and then up into his golden eyes. They were filled with a complex mix of emotions, hope, desperation, and a deep, underlying sadness that resonated with something buried deep within her own soul. It was the sadness of a creature who had lived too long, seen too much, carried too heavy a burden. "Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why now?" After all these years, Reese lowered his hand, the warmth receding, leaving a sudden chill in the air. He turned away, walking towards the altar, his back to her. "The winter line has always been strong," he said, his voice echoing in the vast space of the chapel. "But it has been diluted. Your mother, she chose to leave, to deny her heritage, to embrace the ordinary world." He said the word ordinary with a hint of disdain, as if it were a lesser existence. "And Elsie," he continued, "she tried to protect you, to shield you from the truth. But she knew, in her heart, that you couldn't escape your destiny. That's why she wanted to come back, to prepare the way." Kasha thought of her grandmother, of the quiet strength she had always possessed, of the unspoken secrets that had always seemed to shimmer beneath the surface of her carefully constructed normalcy. Had Elsie known all along? Had she been carrying this burden, this knowledge, all these years? "But I don't know anything about this," Kasha protested, her voice rising in frustration. "I don't know anything about magic, about soul bonds, about being a winter." Reese turned back to face her, his expression softening. "You will learn, Kasha. You have the blood of the winters in your veins. The power is there, dormant, waiting to be awakened." He walked back towards her, stopping just a few feet away. "I can teach you. I can guide you. We can do this together." His words, his presence were overwhelming. She felt a pull towards him, a magnetic force that seemed to draw her in, despite her fear and apprehension. It was the same pull she had felt at the river, at the bridge, the same feeling that had drawn her to this chapel. It was a feeling of belonging, of destiny. But there was also fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the responsibility, fear of losing herself in this bond. "What if I don't want this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What if I refuse?" Reese's expression darkened. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by a chilling intensity. The consequences would be dire. For Hollow Creek. For the world. The veil is thin, Kasha. And without the winter Hollowfang bond, it will break. And what lies beyond is not something you want to face. He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I believe you do want this, Kasha. Deep down, you know this is your purpose. You feel it, don't you?" He was right. She did feel it. A deep, resonating truth that had been buried beneath years of denial and self-doubt. She had always felt like an outsider, like she didn't quite belong, like there was something missing from her life. And now, standing here in this ancient chapel, facing this creature of legend, she realized what it was. It was her heritage, her destiny, her connection to Hollowfang. But could she embrace it? Could she surrender to this bond? Could she trust this man, this wolf, with her life, her soul? She looked at him, at his strong, handsome face, at his golden eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. And she saw not just a creature of legend, but a man, a being who was burdened by his own destiny, who was reaching out to her, not just for his own survival, but for the survival of everything he was sworn to protect. She thought of Elsie, of her quiet strength, of her final wish. She thought of the frozen river, of the self-lighting torches, of the whispers of the trees. She thought of the feeling of belonging, of purpose, that had been missing from her life for so long. And she knew what she had to do. "Tell me," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "Tell me what I need to know." A flicker of relief crossed Reese's face, followed by a slow, hopeful smile. He reached out again, and this time, she didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his. His skin was warm, surprisingly so, and a jolt of energy surged through her, like a lightning strike. It was a powerful, overwhelming sensation, a feeling of connection, of rightness. The chapel seemed to fade away, the only reality being the touch of his hand in hers, the intensity of his golden eyes, the undeniable pull of the bond that was forming between them. He squeezed her hand gently, his gaze never leaving hers. "It begins, Kasha," he whispered. "The awakening of the winter. The return of Hollowfang." The bond pulsed, and she could feel his life. His long life. The sadness he spoke of before? It had barely scratched the surface. Chapter 4. The Whispers of Winter's Past. The touch lingered, a conduit of power and shared history. It wasn't just a physical connection, it felt as though their very beings were intertwining, threads of their souls weaving together in a tapestry centuries in the making. Kasha felt a rush of images, fleeting and fragmented, like glimpses into a dream she couldn't quite grasp. She saw wolves running through moonlit forests, ancient rituals performed under the watchful eyes of the stars, faces of winter's past, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Reese's grip tightened, anchoring her to the present, to the reality of the ancient chapel and the daunting task that lay ahead. "The first step," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to resonate from the very stones around them, "is to understand your heritage. To learn the history of the winters of Hollowfang, of the bond that ties us together." He released her hand, the sudden absence of his touch leaving a void, a strange emptiness that surprised her with its intensity. He gestured towards a narrow, arched doorway hidden behind the altar. "There's a library of sorts. A collection of journals, texts, artifacts, the accumulated knowledge of generations of winters." Kasha followed him through the doorway, her senses heightened, her mind racing. The library was a small, circular chamber, its walls lined with shelves overflowing with books and scrolls. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and dust, a musty aroma that spoke of secrets and forgotten lore. A single window, high up in the wall, allowed a shaft of moonlight to illuminate the room, casting long, dancing shadows. Reese lit a candelabra, the flickering flames revealing the intricate carvings on the wooden shelves, the faded titles on the spines of the books, the strange symbols etched into the stone floor. "These are the records of your ancestors, Kasha," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that surprised her. "Their struggles, their triumphs, their sacrifices." He pulled a thick, leather-bound volume from a shelf, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. He opened it carefully, revealing elegant, handwritten script and intricate illustrations. "This is the journal of Alara Winter, your great-great-grandmother," he said. "She was the one who solidified the bond with Hollowfang, who established the rituals, the traditions that have been passed down through the generations." Kasha peered at the journal, her fingers tracing the faded ink. She recognized the handwriting, a more elaborate version of the script she had seen on Elsie's postcard. It was a tangible link to her past, to a history she had never known. "Read it," Reese urged. "And read the others. Immerse yourself in the knowledge of your ancestors. It will help you understand your role, your power." Kasha spent the next few hours poring over the journals, the scrolls, the ancient texts. She read of Alara's courage, her determination to protect her people, her love for the Hollowfang of her time. She read of subsequent winters, each facing their own challenges, their own trials, their own sacrifices. She read of the rituals, the ceremonies, the magic that flowed through their veins, the power they wielded to maintain the balance between worlds. She learned of the creatures that lurked beyond the veil, the shadows that threatened to engulf Hollow Creek, the constant vigilance required to keep them at bay. She learned of the soul bond, the joining of spirits that amplified the power of both Winter and Hollowfang, creating a force capable of repelling even the darkest of threats. And she began to understand the weight of her inheritance, the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. As she read, Reese remained silent, watching her with a patient, watchful gaze. He seemed to understand the need for her to absorb this knowledge, to come to terms with her past, to embrace her destiny. The more she read, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The strange occurrences of her childhood, the whispers of the elders, Elsie's evasiveness, her own sense of displacement, it all made sense now. She was a Winter, a descendant of a long line of powerful women, women who had sacrificed everything to protect their town, their people, their bond. But there was one recurring theme that troubled her, a thread of darkness that ran through the journals, a shadow that loomed over the Winter legacy. It was the mention of a rivalry, a conflict, a betrayal. She found a passage in Alara's journal, written in a frantic, almost desperate hand. The Shadowclaw, he grows stronger. He covets the power of Hollowfang, the power of the bond. He seeks to break it, to twist it to his own dark purposes. He must be stopped. But at what cost? Kasha looked up at Rhys, her eyes filled with questions. Who is Shadowclaw? She asked. What is this rivalry? Rhys's expression darkened. His golden eyes lost their warmth, replaced by a chilling intensity. He closed Alara's journal, his hand lingering on the cover. Shadowclaw is another line, he said, his voice low and tight. A branch of the werewolves who rejected the bond, who sought to control the power of Hollow Creek for their own selfish gain. They have been our enemies for centuries. A constant threat. And they're still out there? Kasha asked, a tremor of fear running through her. Rhys nodded. They are. And they are growing stronger. The weakening of the bond has emboldened them. They sense an opportunity to strike. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. That's why we must act quickly, Kasha. We must strengthen the bond. We must prepare for the inevitable confrontation. The weight of his words, the weight of the ancient rivalry, the weight of the impending danger, pressed down on her. She felt a surge of fear, but also a growing sense of resolve. She was a Winter, and she would not let her ancestors down. She would not let Hollow Creek fall. What do we do? She asked, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. Rhys smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. We begin the ritual, he said. The ritual of binding. He took her hand, and in his eyes, Kasha read not only an ageless sorrow, but an unyielding commitment. And in his touch, a strength she knew she would need. Chapter 5. A town shrouded in secrets. The ritual. The word hung in the air, heavy with both promise and trepidation. It was a step towards embracing her destiny, but also a leap into the unknown, a commitment to a path she was only beginning to understand. Before we begin, Rhys said, his voice pulling her back from the swirling thoughts in her mind, you need to see Hollow Creek. To understand the town you are bound to protect. To meet its people and its secrets. He led her out of the chapel, back into the crisp night air. The frozen river still shimmered under the moonlight, a constant reminder of the unnatural forces at play. They walked towards the town, the silence broken only by the crunch of their boots on the gravel road and the distant hooting of an owl. Hollow Creek, by night, was a different creature than the sleepy, almost forgotten town Kasha remembered from her childhood visits. The houses, mostly old Victorian and craftsman style, were dark and silent, their windows like watchful eyes staring out into the night. There was a sense of waiting, of anticipation, that hung in the air, a feeling that the town itself was holding its breath. As they walked, Rhys began to tell her about the town's inhabitants, the families who had lived there for generations, their lives intertwined with the history of the Winters and Hollowfang. He spoke of the millers, the blacksmiths, whose ancestors had forged the weapons used in the ancient battles against Shadowclaw. He spoke of the O'Connells, the farmers, whose land bordered the enchanted forest, the place where the veil between worlds was thinnest. He spoke of the Davies, the shopkeepers, whose store had been a gathering place for generations, a place where secrets were whispered and rumors were spread. They all know, on some level, Rhys said, his voice low. They may not understand the details, but they feel the presence, the magic, the danger. He stopped in front of a small, unassuming cottage, its windows dark and shuttered. "This is where the elder council meets," he said. "They are the keepers of the town's traditions, the ones who remember the old ways." Kasia peered at the cottage, imagining the hushed conversations, the ancient rituals that took place within its walls. She felt a sudden urge to meet them, to learn from them, to connect with the living history of Hollow Creek. "Can I talk to them?" she asked. Reese hesitated. "They are wary of outsiders. Even winters who have been away for so long. They will need to be convinced of your commitment." He continued their walk, leading her through the narrow, winding streets. They passed the town square, its fountain dry and silent, its benches empty. They passed the old schoolhouse, its windows boarded up, a relic of a time when Hollow Creek had been a thriving community. As they neared the edge of town, Reese stopped in front of a large, rambling house, its paint peeling, its porch sagging. It was the winter house, the place where Kasia had spent her childhood summers, the place where Elsie had tried to shield her from the truth. "This is where you will stay," Reese said. "It's empty now, but it still holds the memories of your family, the power of the winters." Kasia looked at the house, a wave of conflicting emotions washing over her. Nostalgia, sadness, fear, and a strange sense of homecoming. She had avoided this place for so long, tried to erase it from her memory, but now it was pulling her back, drawing her into its embrace. He produced a key, old and tarnished, from a pocket in his tunic. "I'll leave you to settle in. We'll begin the preparations for the ritual tomorrow." He turned to leave, but Kasia stopped him. "Reese," she said, her voice hesitant. "What exactly does the ritual entail?" He paused, his back to her. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "It's a joining," he said finally. "A merging of our energies, our spirits. It will require trust, vulnerability, and a sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Kasia asked, her heart pounding in her chest. He turned to face her, his golden eyes searching hers. "The sacrifice of your old life," he said. "Of the world you knew. You must embrace your destiny, Kasia. Fully. Without reservation." He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "It won't be easy, but it will be worth it. For you, for Hollow Creek, for us all." He left her then, disappearing into the shadows, leaving her alone with the looming presence of the winter house and the weight of the impending ritual. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the house, at the town, at the frozen river, at the moonlit sky. She felt a sense of overwhelming responsibility, of fear, but also of excitement. She was a winter, and she was home. But walking inside, the weight of the word home crumbled. It smelled of disuse and dust, a shell of what it had been. She was truly alone now. Chapter 6. The Silver Ring's Promise. The interior of the winter house was a mausoleum of memories, each room a silent testament to a life Kasia had only glimpsed in fragments. Dust motes danced in the moonlight filtering through the grimy windows, illuminating faded floral wallpaper, heavy, dark furniture draped in white sheets, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors she didn't recognize. The air was thick with the scent of disuse, of old wood and dried flowers, a poignant reminder of time's relentless passage. Kasia moved through the house like a ghost herself, her footsteps echoing in the unnerving silence. She ran a hand over the smooth, cool surface of a mahogany table, picturing Elsie sitting there, sipping tea, telling stories, carefully edited stories, she realized now, with all the magic and the danger meticulously removed. She found her old room, a small, attic space under the eaves. The wallpaper was peeling, but the faded pattern of bluebirds and roses was still visible, a bittersweet reminder of her childhood innocence. A single, narrow bed stood against one wall, covered in a dusty quilt. A small, wooden rocking horse sat in the corner, its paint chipped and faded, its mane tangled. Kasia sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, both physical and emotional. The events of the past few hours had been overwhelming, a dizzying plunge into a world she had never imagined. She was tired, scared, and uncertain. She looked around the room, her gaze settling on a small, wooden chest tucked away in a corner. She remembered that chest. Elsie had kept it locked, telling Kasia it contained old family things, nothing of interest to a young girl. Curiosity and a desperate need for some tangible connection to her past propelled her forward. She knelt before the chest, her fingers fumbling with the rusty latch. It was surprisingly easy to open, the lock having deteriorated with age. Inside, nestled amongst layers of yellowed tissue paper, were a collection of objects that seemed to shimmer with a faint, inner light. There were old photographs, faded letters, a dried bouquet of wildflowers, and a ring. It was a silver ring, intricately crafted, depicting a wolf's head with piercing emerald eyes. It was undeniably beautiful, and it radiated a strange energy, a warmth that seemed to pulse in her hand. Kasia slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. As soon as it touched her skin, she felt a jolt, a surge of power that coursed through her veins. Images flashed through her mind, vivid and intense. Elsie, younger, stronger, wearing the same ring, performing a ritual under the moonlight Reese, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, his hand reaching out to her, the frozen river, the chapel, the ancient trees. She gasped, pulling the ring off, her hand trembling. It was too much, too intense, too real. But she couldn't deny the power she had felt, the connection to her heritage, to Reese, to Hollowfang. The ring was a key, a conduit, a promise. She carefully placed the ring back in the chest, closing the lid. She needed time to process, to understand, to prepare herself for what was to come. She decided to explore the rest of the house. She found the kitchen, its old-fashioned stove and sink covered in a layer of dust. She found the living room, its fireplace cold and empty, its bookshelves filled with volumes on gardening, cooking, and local history. She picked up a book titled Hollow Creek, a chronicle, its cover depicting a stylized image of a wolf howling at the moon. She opened it, flipping through the pages, her eyes scanning the text. It was a detailed account of the town's history, from its founding to the present day. And then she saw it, a chapter titled The Winter Hollowfang Pact. She sat down at the kitchen table, the book open before her, and began to read. The chapter detailed the origins of the bond, the ancient agreement between the Winter family and the werewolves of Hollowfang, the rituals, the responsibilities, the sacrifices. It confirmed what Reese had told her, but it also revealed new details, nuances that he had omitted. It spoke of the power of the bond, the ability to control the forces of nature, to heal, to protect, to command. But it also spoke of the dangers, the temptations, the potential for corruption. It spoke of Shadowclaw, the rival clan, their relentless pursuit of the bond's power, their willingness to do anything to achieve their goals. And it spoke of the price of the soul bond. The text was ambiguous, veiled in metaphor and symbolism, but the implication was clear. The soul bond was not just a joining of spirits, it was a merging, a blending of two beings into one, a loss of individuality, of self. Kasia closed the book, her heart pounding in her chest. This was what Reese hadn't told her. This was the true sacrifice. Not just the sacrifice of her old life, but the sacrifice of herself. She looked down at her hand, at the empty space where the ring had been. She felt a surge of fear, of doubt, of rebellion. Could she do this? Could she give up everything, even her own identity, for a town, for a bond, for a creature she barely knew? Could she, in a world, in a life that had never been her own, possibly find herself by losing herself? She felt a sob escape. Chapter 7. Dreams of Fire and Fur. Sleep, when it finally came, was not a refuge but a battlefield. Kasia tossed and turned in the narrow bed, the dusty quilt tangled around her legs, her mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions and unsettling images. The silver ring, though tucked away in the chest, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its presence a constant reminder of the decision she faced, the sacrifice she was being asked to make. Her dreams were vivid, fragmented, and intensely real. She dreamt of running through a moonlit forest, the trees towering above her like ancient sentinels, their branches reaching out like grasping claws. She was being pursued, she knew, by something unseen, something terrifying, something that smelled of smoke and shadows. She dreamt of the chapel, its torches burning brightly, illuminating the faded frescoes of wolves and men, of ancient rituals and forgotten magic. She saw Rhys, his golden eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity, his hand reaching out to her, offering her a choice, a destiny, a bond. She dreamt of fire, of flames engulfing the forest, consuming everything in their path. She saw the faces of the Winters, their eyes filled with fear and determination, their voices raised in a desperate plea. She saw Shadowclaw, a dark, menacing figure, his eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light, his laughter echoing through the burning trees. And she dreamt of the wolf. It was a magnificent creature, its fur the color of moonlight, its eyes the same piercing emerald green as the stone in the silver ring. It stood before her, proud and powerful, its gaze both wild and gentle. It was Rhys, she knew, in his true form, the form he had hidden from her, the form that represented both his power and his vulnerability. The wolf spoke to her, not with words, but with images, with emotions, with a deep, resonant understanding that transcended language. It showed her the beauty of Hollow Creek, the magic that flowed through its veins, the connection between the land, the people, and the creatures that protected it. It showed her the danger, the threat of Shadowclaw, the darkness that loomed beyond the veil, the chaos that would ensue if the bond were broken. And it showed her herself. She saw herself standing beside the wolf, her hand resting on its fur, a bond of trust and understanding between them. She saw herself wielding power, the power of the Winters, the power of Hollowfang, the power of the soul bond. She saw herself protecting Hollow Creek, defending its people, fulfilling her destiny. But she also saw the cost. She saw herself fading, her individuality dissolving, her essence merging with the wolf's, becoming one with the ancient magic, with the land, with Hollowfang. She saw the loss of her memories, her dreams, herself. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, her body drenched in sweat. The first rays of dawn were filtering through the dusty window, casting long, pale shadows across the room. The dreams were still vivid in her mind, the images, the emotions, the fear. She got out of bed, her legs shaky, her mind reeling. She needed to clear her head, to make sense of the conflicting messages, the daunting choices that lay before her. She went downstairs to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee. The familiar ritual, the scent of the brewing coffee, the warmth of the mug in her hands, helped to ground her, to bring her back to the present. As she sipped her coffee, she thought about the dreams, about the wolf, about the bond, about the sacrifice. She realized that the dreams weren't just random images, they were visions, glimpses into the past, the present, and the future. They were a warning but also an invitation. She understood now, on a deeper level, what the soul bond entailed. It was not just a merging of spirits, it was a transformation, a becoming, a shedding of the old self to embrace a new, more powerful, more connected existence. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also exhilarating. She thought of Rhys, of his golden eyes, of his quiet strength, of his loneliness. She thought of the town, of its people, of its secrets, of its magic. She thought of her ancestors, of their courage, their determination, their sacrifices. And she began to understand that the sacrifice was not just about loss, it was about gain. It was about becoming something more, something greater, something that transcended the limitations of her individual self. It was about fulfilling her destiny. She finished her coffee, her mind made up. She would embrace the bond. She would become the Winter she was meant to be. She would protect Hollow Creek. But she would not lose herself completely. She would find a way to maintain her individuality, her memories, her essence. She would find a way to balance the power of the bond with the self she had fought so hard to create. She owed that much to Elsie, to the woman she'd been. She went back upstairs, to her old room, and retrieved the silver ring from the chest. She slipped it onto her finger, feeling the familiar jolt of power, the connection to Reese, to Hollowfang, to her destiny. The ring felt right, natural. A promise, indeed. Chapter 8. The hunt begins anew. The morning air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, a familiar fragrance that stirred a sense of anticipation within Kasia. She stood on the porch of the winter house, the silver ring heavy on her finger, her gaze fixed on the forest that loomed beyond the town, a vast, emerald expanse that held both beauty and danger. She knew Reese would be coming for her. He had said they would begin the preparations for the ritual today, and she was ready. More than ready. She was determined. She didn't have to wait long. He emerged from the trees, his figure tall and imposing, his golden eyes scanning the house, the town, the surrounding landscape. He moved with a fluid grace, a silent, almost spectral presence, a creature perfectly attuned to his environment. He stopped before her, his gaze meeting hers. He didn't speak, but she saw a flicker of approval in his eyes. A silent acknowledgement of her decision, of her commitment. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "Good. We have much to do." He led her into the forest, following a narrow, winding path that seemed to disappear into the dense undergrowth. The trees towered above them, their branches intertwined, creating a canopy of green that filtered the sunlight, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. As they walked, Reese began to explain the first step of the preparations. "The ritual requires ingredients," he said. "Elements that represent the four corners of the earth, the four aspects of the bond. Earth, air, fire, and water." "And where do we find these ingredients?" Kasia asked. "They are hidden," Reese said. "Scattered throughout the forest, protected by guardians." "Guardians?" Kasia echoed, a tremor of apprehension running through her. Reese nodded. "Creatures of the forest, spirits of the land, beings who have been tasked with safeguarding the elements. They will test you, Kasia. They will challenge your strength, your courage, your resolve." He stopped, turning to face her. "This is not a game, Kasia. This is a hunt. A quest. And the stakes are high." He reached into a pouch at his belt and produced a small, leather-bound book. "This is a guide," he said. "It contains the locations of the elements, the descriptions of the guardians, and the rituals required to obtain them." Kasia took the book, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings on the cover. It felt heavy in her hand, weighted with the responsibility of the task ahead. "The first element is earth," Reese said. "It is hidden in the heart of the Whispering Woods, guarded by the Oak King." Kasia opened the book, flipping through the pages, her eyes scanning the text and the illustrations. She found the entry for the Oak King, a majestic, ancient tree, its branches reaching up to the sky like gnarled fingers, its roots buried deep in the earth. The description was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Oak King was said to be a being of immense power, capable of controlling the very fabric of the forest, of summoning storms, of crushing those who dared to trespass on his domain. "How do we approach him?" Kasia asked, her voice barely a whisper. "With respect," Reese said. "With humility. And with an offering." He reached into his pouch again and produced a small, silver vial filled with a shimmering, golden liquid. "This is moonlight," he said. "Collected from the surface of the frozen river, under the full moon. It is a sacred substance, a gift from the moon goddess." He handed her the vial. "You must offer this to the Oak King, Kasia. You must speak to him, from your heart. You must convince him to grant you the element of earth." Kasia took the vial, her hand trembling. She felt a surge of fear, but also a growing sense of determination. She was a winter, and she would not fail. They continued their journey, deeper into the forest, the trees growing taller, the shadows growing darker. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ancient magic, of power. As they approached the Whispering Woods, Kasia heard it. A low, rustling sound, like 1,000 voices whispering secrets in the wind. It was the trees, she realized, communicating with each other, warning each other of their approach. The hunt had begun. The guardians were waiting. And Kasha Winter, armed with moonlight and the courage that ran through her blood, prepared for her first test. She took a breath and stepped into the whispering shadows. Chapter 9. Beneath the pale moonlight's gaze. The Whispering Woods lived up to its name. The sound intensified as Kasha and Reese entered the grove, a constant murmur that seemed to penetrate her very bones, a chorus of ancient voices whispering secrets she couldn't quite decipher. The trees were taller here, their branches more intertwined, the canopy thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The air was heavy, still, and charged with an almost palpable energy. Kasha felt a prickling sensation on her skin, a sense of being watched, of being judged. Reese led her through the labyrinthine paths, his senses alert, his body poised for action. He moved with a quiet grace, a predator in his natural habitat, his golden eyes scanning the shadows, listening for any sign of danger. "He's close," Reese murmured, his voice barely audible above the whispering of the trees. "Be ready." Kasha clutched the silver vial containing the moonlight, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a surge of fear, but also a strange sense of excitement. This was it. Her first test. Her first step towards embracing her destiny. They rounded a bend in the path, and there it was. The Oak King. It was a tree unlike any Kasha had ever seen. It was immense, its trunk wider than a car, its branches reaching up to the sky like the arms of a giant, its roots burrowing deep into the earth, anchoring it to the very core of the forest. Its bark was gnarled and weathered, covered in moss and lichen, its leaves a deep, vibrant green that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. The tree was alive, in a way that transcended mere biology. It pulsed with energy, with power, with consciousness. Kasha could feel its presence, its awareness, its judgment. She stepped forward, slowly, hesitantly, her gaze fixed on the massive trunk. She could feel Reese's presence behind her, a silent, watchful guardian, ready to intervene if necessary, but also allowing her to face this challenge on her own. She stopped a few feet from the tree, her heart pounding in her chest. She uncorked the silver vial, the scent of the moonlight, sweet and ethereal, filling the air. "Great Oak King," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but gaining strength with each word. "I am Kasha Winter, the last of my line. I come before you with respect and humility, seeking your aid." She held out the vial, offering it to the tree. "I bring you a gift, a sacred offering of moonlight, collected from the frozen river, under the full moon. A token of my sincerity." The whispering of the trees intensified, a swirling vortex of sound that seemed to surround her, to penetrate her very being. She felt a pressure in her head, a dizzying sensation, as if the tree were probing her mind, searching her soul, judging her worthiness. She closed her eyes, focusing on her intention, on her purpose, on her connection to Hollow Creek, to the Winters, to Hollowfang. She poured out her heart, her fears, her hopes, her determination. She spoke of her grandmother, of Elsie's final wish, of her own return to Hollow Creek, of her encounter with Reese, of the bond. She spoke of the danger, the threat of Shadowclaw, the weakening of the veil, the need to restore the balance, to protect the town, to fulfill her destiny. She spoke of her love for the land, for the forest, for the magic that flowed through its veins. And she spoke of her willingness to sacrifice her old life, her fears, her doubts, to embrace her destiny, to become the Winter she was meant to be. When she opened her eyes, the whispering had subsided. The air was still, silent, expectant. The Oak King remained motionless, but Kasha felt a shift, a change in its presence, in its energy. A single leaf, golden and shimmering, detached itself from a branch and floated down, landing gently in her outstretched hand. Kasha gasped. It was a sign, an acceptance, a gift. She looked up at the tree, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Great Oak King." She turned to Reese, her face radiant. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "You did it, Kasha," he said. "You passed the first test." He took the golden leaf from her hand, carefully placing it in a small, leather pouch. "This is the element of earth," he said. "A piece of the Oak King's essence, a symbol of his power, his blessing." They left the whispering woods, the rustling of the trees now a gentle murmur, a farewell, a promise. As they walked, Kasha felt a surge of confidence, of strength, of belonging. She had faced her fear, she had proven her worth, she had connected with the ancient magic of Hollow Creek. She was one step closer to fulfilling her destiny. But as the moonlight cast long shadows, she also knew the journey was far from over. Many more trials awaited. And the ease of this first victory felt almost ominous. Chapter 10. The Curse of Unspoken Truths. With the element of earth secured, a newfound confidence surged through Kasha, tempered by the sobering realization that this was merely the first step on a perilous path. The ease with which she'd gained the Oak King's blessing, while a relief, also felt unsettling, a lull before a gathering storm. "What's next?" Kasha asked, as they walked back towards the town, the forest slowly giving way to the familiar sights of Hollow Creek. Reese glanced at her, his golden eyes assessing, searching. "The element of air," he replied, his voice low and thoughtful. "It is hidden atop the Widow's Peak, guarded by the sky spirits." Widow's Peak. The name itself sent a shiver down Kasha's spine. It was a towering cliff that overlooked the town, a place shrouded in local lore and whispered tragedies. It was said that a young woman, heartbroken by the loss of her lover at sea, had thrown herself from the cliff, her spirit forever haunting the wind-swept summit. "The sky spirits are different," Reese continued, his voice taking on a cautious tone. "They are not bound by the same rules as the Oak King. They are capricious, unpredictable, and easily angered." He stopped, turning to face her, his gaze intense. "You must be careful, Kasha. You must approach them with caution. And with a different kind of offering." He reached into his pouch and produced a small, intricately carved wooden flute. It was made of a dark, almost black wood, and it seemed to hum with a faint, ethereal energy. "This is the Whisperwind flute," he said. "It was crafted by the ancestors of the O'Connell family, the farmers who live at the foot of the peak. It is said to be able to soothe the spirits, to calm the winds, to open a pathway to the sky." He handed her the flute. "You must play it, Kasha. You must create a melody that speaks to the sky spirits, that expresses your intentions, that convinces them to grant you the element of air." Kasha took the flute, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool surface of the wood. She had never played a musical instrument before, but she felt a strange connection to this flute, a sense of familiarity, as if she had held it in her hands many times before. I don't know how to play," she confessed, her voice hesitant. Reese smiled, a reassuring smile that eased her anxiety. "The flute will guide you, Kasha. Trust your instincts. Trust the magic. Let the music flow through you." They continued their walk, reaching the edge of town, where the path to Widow's Peak began. It was a steep, winding trail, carved into the side of the cliff, its surface rough and uneven. As they climbed, the wind grew stronger, whipping around them, tugging at their clothes, carrying the scent of salt and sea spray. The view from the cliff was breathtaking, a panoramic vista of Hollow Creek, the forest, the river, and the distant ocean. But the beauty was overshadowed by a sense of unease. The air was charged with a strange energy, a feeling of unpredictability. Kasha could feel the presence of the sky spirits, swirling around them, invisible but palpable. They reached the summit, a flat, windswept expanse of rock, overlooking the town below. The wind howled around them, a deafening roar that seemed to carry the whispers of lost souls. Kasha took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She raised the Whisperwind flute to her lips, her fingers trembling slightly. She closed her eyes, focusing on her intention, on her purpose, on her connection to Hollow Creek, to the winters, to Hollowfang. She began to play. At first, the sound was hesitant, uncertain, a series of disjointed notes that were quickly swallowed by the wind. But gradually, as she relaxed, as she allowed the magic to flow through her, the music began to take shape. It was a haunting melody, a mournful lament that spoke of loss, of grief, of longing. It was a song of the wind, of the sky, of the spirits that dwelled there. As she played, the wind seemed to respond. It shifted, changed direction, swirling around her, creating a vortex of sound and energy. She felt a presence, a consciousness drawing closer, listening, observing, judging. She continued to play, pouring her heart and soul into the music. She played of her own losses, of her own grief, of her own longing for a home, for a connection, for a purpose. She played of the winters, of their struggles, of their triumphs, of their sacrifices. She played of the bond, of the need to restore the balance, to protect Hollow Creek, to fulfill her destiny. And she played of hope, of the possibility of a new beginning, of a brighter future, of a world where the darkness was held at bay. When she finally lowered the flute, the wind had calmed. The air was still, silent, expectant. A single, shimmering feather, iridescent and ethereal, floated down from the sky, landing gently in her outstretched hand.
Kasha gasped. It was a sign.
An acceptance. A gift. She looked up at the sky, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, sky spirits." She turned to Rhys, her face radiant. He smiled, a knowing smile that spoke of pride and relief. "You did it again, Kasha," he said. "You are proving to be a true winter." He took the feather from her hand, carefully placing it in the leather pouch, beside the golden leaf. "This is the element of air," he said. "A gift from the sky spirits, a symbol of their power, their blessing." But as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a sudden, chilling realization washed over Kasha. Each element, while freely given, demanded a truth. And she hadn't told Rhys the whole truth about the book in the winter house, the cost of the soul bond. This omission felt like a crack in the very foundation of their burgeoning connection. And that crack, she feared, could become a chasm. Chapter 11. A bond forged in starlight. The weight of the unspoken truth pressed down on Kasha, a heavy burden that grew heavier with each passing hour. The ease with which she had obtained the first two elements, while encouraging, now felt tainted by her deception, by the secret she was keeping from Rhys. They returned to the winter house, the silence between them filled with an unspoken tension. Kasha busied herself with preparing a simple meal, using the meager supplies she had found in the dusty pantry. Rhys, usually so talkative, so eager to share his knowledge, remained withdrawn, his golden eyes shadowed, his thoughts seemingly far away. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clinking of cutlery and the crackling of the fire Kasha had managed to lighten the hearth. The warmth of the fire did little to dispel the chill that had settled between them, a chill that stemmed not from the temperature, but from the unspoken words, the hidden truths. After dinner, Rhys finally broke the silence. "We need to prepare for the next element," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth.
"Fire."
Kasha nodded, her heart heavy. "Where do we find it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "In the heart of the Shadow Caves," Rhys replied. "Guarded by the Flameborn." The Shadow Caves. Another name that sent a shiver down Kasha's spine. They were a network of underground tunnels that ran beneath Hollow Creek, a place of darkness and danger, a place where the veil between worlds was said to be at its thinnest. "The Flameborn are different again," Rhys continued, his voice taking on a grim tone. "They are creatures of pure fire, beings of immense power and destructive potential." He looked at her, his golden eyes searching hers. "This will be the most dangerous test yet, Kasha. You must be prepared to fight. To use your power." He reached into his pouch and produced nothing. He frowned, patting his pockets, his expression turning to one of confusion. I had it," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. "The Firestone." a relic passed down through generations of Hollowfangs. It is said to be able to control the Flameborn, to command their power. He looked at Kasha, his eyes filled with a sudden, chilling realization.
It's gone, he said. Stolen.
Kasha stared at him, her mind reeling. The Firestone stolen? By whom?
And why?
The answer came to her in a flash of insight, a terrifying realization that made her blood run cold. Shadowclaw. They had been watching them, waiting for an opportunity to strike. And they had chosen this moment, when Kasha and Reese were at their most vulnerable, to steal the one thing that could protect them from the Flameborn. We have to get it back, Kasha said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. Reese nodded, his expression grim.
But how?
We don't know where they've taken it. Kasha thought for a moment, her mind racing. She remembered the passage in Alara's journal, the one that mentioned Shadowclaw's coveting of the bond's power, their desire to break it, to twist it to their own dark purposes.
They want the bond, she said.
They want to control it. And they know that we are close to completing the ritual. She looked at Reese, her eyes filled with a sudden, desperate hope. They'll be waiting for us, she said. At the Shadow Caves. They'll use the Firestone to lure us in. Reese understood. It was a trap, a dangerous gamble, but it was their only chance.
We have no choice, he said.
We have to go. He took her hand, his grip firm, reassuring. But we won't go unprepared, he said. We'll use what we have. The elements we've already gathered. And each other. He looked at her, his golden eyes glowing with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. It was a look of determination, of courage, but also of something more. It was a look of trust. Despite the secret she was keeping, despite the danger that lay ahead, he was trusting her. He was relying on her. He was bonding with her. And in that moment, under the pale starlight filtering through the window, Kasha felt a surge of connection. A connection to Reese, to Hollowfang, to her destiny. It was a fragile bond, still forming, still vulnerable, but it was there. A thread of hope, a spark of light, in the gathering darkness. They left the house, walking hand in hand towards the Shadow Caves, their hearts pounding in unison, their steps echoing in the silent night. A bond was forming, but could it withstand the lies between them? Chapter 12. The Gathering Storm's Fury. The entrance to the Shadow Caves was a gaping maw in the side of a hill, hidden behind a curtain of tangled vines and thorny bushes. The air around it was cold and damp, carrying the scent of sulfur and decay, a palpable sense of wrongness. As Kasha and Reese approached, the sky above them began to churn. Dark clouds gathered, swirling ominously, blotting out the stars, plunging the landscape into an even deeper darkness. The wind picked up, whipping around them, carrying with it the first fat drops of rain. It's them, Reese said, his voice low and grim. Shadowclaw. They're trying to disrupt us. To weaken us. He looked at Kasha, his golden eyes searching hers. Are you ready? He asked. Kasha nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She was afraid, yes, but she was also determined. She would not let Shadowclaw win. She would not let them break the bond. She would not let them destroy Hollow Creek. She reached into her pouch, touching the golden leaf, the shimmering feather, the small, empty vial that had once held the moonlight. She felt a surge of power, a connection to the elements, to the magic of Hollow Creek, to Reese. They pushed aside the vines and entered the caves, the darkness swallowing them whole. The only light came from the faint, ethereal glow of the elements in Kasha's pouch, casting long, dancing shadows on the damp, uneven walls. The air inside the caves was thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the dripping of water and the occasional scuttling sound of some unseen creature. They walked deeper into the labyrinthine tunnels, following a narrow, winding path that seemed to lead them further and further into the bowels of the earth. Reese moved with a cautious grace, his senses alert, his body poised for action. They'll be waiting for us, he said, his voice barely a whisper. In the central chamber. That's where the Flameborn are. He stopped, turning to face her. We need a plan, Kasha. We can't just rush in. Kasha thought for a moment, her mind racing. She remembered the book she had found in the winter house, the one that described the shadow caves, the Flameborn, and the Firestone. The Firestone can control the Flameborn, she said, but it can also amplify their power. If Shadowclaw has it, they'll be able to use it against us. She looked at Reese, her eyes filled with a sudden, desperate idea. We need to counteract it, she said. We need to use the elements we have to create a balance. A shield. Reese understood. He nodded, his expression grim. Earth, air, and what's left of the moonlight's essence. It's a long shot, Kasha, but it's our only chance. They continued their walk, reaching a large, cavernous chamber. The air here was hot and dry, the walls glowing with a faint, reddish light. In the center of the chamber, a pool of molten lava bubbled and churned, casting an eerie, flickering glow on the surrounding rocks. And around the pool they saw them. The Flameborn. They were creatures of pure fire, their bodies shimmering and shifting, their eyes burning with an intense, malevolent light. They were humanoid in shape, but their limbs were elongated and distorted, their hands ending in sharp, fiery claws. And standing amongst them, holding the Firestone aloft, was a figure Kasha recognized from her dreams. Shadowclaw. He was tall and imposing, his body clad in dark, leather armor, his face hidden behind a mask of bone. His eyes, however, were visible, and they burned with a cold, cruel light, the color of the lava that surrounded him. Welcome, Winter, Shadowclaw said, his voice a harsh, grating rasp. Welcome, Hollowfang. We've been expecting you. He raised the Firestone, and the Flameborn roared, their fiery bodies intensifying, their heat radiating outwards, threatening to consume everything in their path. You cannot stop us, Shadowclaw said. The bond will be broken. Hollow Creek will be ours. Kasha and Reese exchanged a look. It was time. Kasha stepped forward, her hand reaching into her pouch. She drew out the golden leaf, the shimmering feather, and the empty vial. She held them aloft, focusing her will, her intention, her power. Earth, air, moonlight's memory, she chanted, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the vast chamber. Protect us. Shield us. Balance the fire. The elements responded. The golden leaf glowed brighter, the shimmering feather shimmered more intensely, and the empty vial filled with a faint, ethereal light, the residual essence of the moonlight. A wave of energy emanated from the elements, forming a protective shield around Kasha and Reese, a barrier of earth, air, and memory that deflected the heat of the Flameborn, neutralizing their power. Reese stepped forward, his own power surging, his golden eyes glowing with an intense light. He roared, a primal sound that shook the very foundations of the cave, a challenge to Shadowclaw, a defiance of his power. The storm outside continued. Now the storm inside had just begun. The clash was inevitable. Chapter 13. Echoes of a Forgotten Love. The battle raged. The chamber echoed with the roar of the Flameborn, the clash of Reese's power against Shadowclaw's, the crackling of the elements as Kasha struggled to maintain the protective shield. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and ozone, the heat intense, the light blinding. Shadowclaw, wielding the Firestone, directed the Flameborn, sending waves of fire towards Kasha and Reese, trying to break through their defenses. But the shield held, the combined power of earth, air, and the memory of moonlight deflecting the flames, protecting them from the onslaught. Reese, in his partially shifted form, was a force of nature, his claws and fangs tearing at the Flameborn, his roars shaking the very foundations of the cave. He was fighting with a ferocity Kasha had never seen before, a desperate attempt to protect her, to protect Hollow Creek, to protect the bond. But Shadowclaw was strong, his power amplified by the Firestone. He was a skilled fighter, his movements swift and deadly, his eyes burning with a cold, cruel hatred. As the battle wore on, Kasha began to feel the strain. Maintaining the shield was taking its toll, draining her energy, weakening her resolve. She could feel the heat of the flames, the pressure of Shadowclaw's power, pressing against her, threatening to overwhelm her. She looked at Rhys, his body battered and bruised, his fur singed, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of determination and desperation. She knew he couldn't keep fighting like this forever. They needed to find a way to defeat Shadowclaw, to reclaim the Firestone, to end this. And then she remembered.
The book.
The passage about the soul bond. The true price. It was a gamble, a desperate, dangerous gamble, but it was their only chance. Rhys. She cried out, her voice barely audible above the roar of the battle. The bond. We need to complete it.
Now.
Rhys understood. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. He knew the risk, the sacrifice, but he also knew that it was their only hope. He nodded, his gaze locking with hers. He roared, a primal sound that echoed through the chamber, a call to the ancient magic, a commitment to the bond. Kasha closed her eyes, focusing her will, her intention, her love. She reached out to Rhys, not with her hands, but with her soul, her spirit, her essence. She poured out her heart, her fears, her hopes, her determination. She offered herself, her individuality, her memories, to the bond, to Rhys, to Hollowfang. She felt a surge of power, a connection unlike anything she had ever experienced before. It was a merging, a blending, a becoming. She felt Rhys's presence within her, his strength, his courage, his love. She felt the ancient magic of Hollow Creek flowing through her veins, the power of the winters, the power of Hollowfang, the power of the bond. She opened her eyes, and she saw the world differently. She saw the Flameborn, not as terrifying creatures, but as beings of energy, connected to the earth, to the fire, to themselves. She saw Shadowclaw, not as an invincible enemy, but as a lost soul, consumed by hatred and regret. And she saw Rhys, not just as a werewolf, a protector, a partner, but as a part of herself, a reflection of her own soul, a love that transcended time and space. The shield shimmered, intensified, growing stronger, more powerful. It was no longer just a barrier of elements, it was a manifestation of the bond, a force field of love, of trust, of sacrifice. Shadowclaw, sensing the shift, the surge of power, recoiled in fear. He raised the Firestone, trying to amplify his own power to counter the bond, but it was too late. The Flameborn, no longer under his control, turned towards him, their fiery eyes burning with a newfound awareness. They recognized the true power, the true bond, and they rejected him. With a roar, they surged towards Shadowclaw, engulfing him in flames, consuming him, ending his reign of terror. The Firestone clattered to the ground, its power extinguished. The chamber fell silent, the only sounds the crackling of the cooling lava and the ragged breathing of Kasha and Rhys. They stood there, hand in hand, their bodies battered and bruised, their spirits merged. The bond was complete. The balance was restored. Hollow Creek was safe. But within the silence, echoes of a previous life, her life, whispered and faded. Chapter 14. The Price of Defiance. The aftermath of the battle was a blur of exhaustion and disorientation. Kasha felt different.
Changed.
The bond was complete, yes, but the merging of their spirits had come at a cost. Her memories, her sense of self, were fragmented, interwoven with Rhys's, with the ancient history of Hollowfang, with the very essence of Hollow Creek. She looked at Rhys, and she saw herself, or rather, a reflection of herself, mingled with his own being. His golden eyes, still luminous, now held a hint of her. His features, still strong and handsome, seemed to have softened, to have taken on a familiarity that was both comforting and unsettling. "Are you all right?" Rhys asked, his voice a low rumble that resonated deep within her. It was his voice, but it also felt like her own. Kasha nodded, but the gesture felt foreign. I think so," she replied, her voice a strange blend of her own and Rhys's. "But it's different. I feel she struggled to find the words to articulate the strange, disorienting sensation of being both herself and not herself. It takes time, Reese said, his hand reaching out to touch hers, a gesture that felt both familiar and new. The bond is strong, but it needs to settle, to find its balance. They left the shadow caves, emerging into the cool night air. The storm had passed, the clouds had cleared, and the stars shone brightly in the inky sky. The town of Hollow Creek lay before them, quiet and peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. They walked back to the winter house, their steps slow and unsteady. Kasha felt a strange detachment from her surroundings, as if she were viewing the world through a filter. The familiar sights of the town, the houses, the trees, the river, seemed distant, unreal. Inside the house, Kasha went to the kitchen to make some tea, a simple, familiar ritual that she hoped would ground her, bring her back to herself. But as she reached for the kettle, her hand hesitated. She couldn't remember where the tea was kept. She looked around the kitchen, her gaze settling on the cabinets, the drawers, the pantry. They were all familiar, yet foreign. She knew she should know where everything was, but the knowledge was buried, hidden beneath layers of Reese's memories, of Hollowfangs' history, of the bond. Reese came into the kitchen, sensing her distress. He saw the confusion in her eyes, the frustration on her face. "It's all right, Kasha," he said, his voice gentle, soothing. "I'll help you." He went to the pantry, retrieving the tea, the sugar, the honey. He filled the kettle, lit the stove, and prepared the tea, his movements smooth and efficient. Kasha watched him, a strange mix of gratitude and resentment swirling within her. She was grateful for his help, for his understanding, but she also resented his presence, his intrusion into her mind, her memories, herself. They sat at the kitchen table, sipping the tea in silence. Kasha felt a growing sense of loss. Loss of her memories, her independence, her identity. I don't remember," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't remember my life before Hollow Creek." "Before you?" Reese looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a deep sadness, a sadness that mirrored her own. "It's the bond, Kasha," he said. "It's stronger than we anticipated. It's overwritten some of your memories. But they're not gone. They're just buried. We can find them. Together." But Kasha wasn't so sure. She felt like a stranger in her own body, in her own mind, in her own life. She had sacrificed everything for the bond, for Hollow Creek, for Reese. But what had she gained? She looked at him, at his handsome face, at his golden eyes, at the reflection of herself within them. And she felt a surge of anger. "This isn't what I wanted," she said, her voice rising. "I didn't want to lose myself. I didn't want to become you." Reese recoiled, his expression hurt, his golden eyes dimming. "Kasha," he said, his voice pleading. "It's not like that. We're together. We're one. We're stronger." "Stronger?" Kasha scoffed. "I feel weaker. I feel lost. I feel like nothing." She stood up, pushing the chair away from the table, her body trembling with rage and despair. "I need space," she said. "I need to think." She left the kitchen, walking out of the house, into the cool night air. She walked towards the river, towards the frozen bridge, towards the chapel. She needed to be alone. She needed to find herself, even if that self was now fundamentally, irrevocably changed. And a horrifying thought began to take shape. Had she defied the cost, or merely delayed it? Chapter 15. Into the heart of the woods. The frozen river shimmered under the moonlight, a spectral mirror reflecting Kasha's fractured state. She crossed the bridge, the wooden planks groaning under her weight, a mournful echo of her own internal turmoil. The chapel stood before her, dark and silent, a sanctuary of secrets, a reminder of the choices she had made, the path she had chosen. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, the hinges creaking in protest, a sound that seemed to amplify the silence within. The interior of the chapel was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the high, arched windows, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls, on the faded frescoes of wolves and men, on the ancient altar. Kasha walked towards the altar, her steps echoing in the vast space. She felt a strange sense of déjà vu, a feeling that she had been here before, many times, in another life, in another form. She reached out, touching the cold, smooth surface of the altar, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings, the symbols of the bond, the sacrifice. She felt a surge of power, a connection to the ancient magic, to the winters, to Hollowfang. But it was a different kind of power now. It was not just the power of the elements, the power of the ritual, the power of the bond. It was the power of loss, the power of grief, the power of rage. She closed her eyes, trying to make sense of the conflicting emotions, the fragmented memories, the blurred identity that plagued her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to break something. But she couldn't.
She was trapped.
Trapped in the bond, trapped in Hollow Creek, trapped in a life that was no longer her own. And then she heard it. A whisper. A faint, ethereal whisper that seemed to come from the very walls of the chapel, from the depths of her own soul, from the past. Kasha, it was a familiar voice, a voice she had heard in her dreams, in her memories, in her heart. It was Elsie's voice. Kasha opened her eyes, looking around the chapel, searching for the source of the whisper. But she was alone. Kasha, don't lose yourself. The voice was stronger now, clearer, more insistent. Kasha felt a surge of hope. Elsie was here, somehow, in spirit, in memory, in the magic of the chapel. Grandmother? She whispered, her voice trembling. Is that you? Yes. Child, it's me. Elsie's voice was filled with a deep sadness, a sadness that mirrored Kasha's own. But it was also filled with strength, with determination. You must fight. Kasha, you must remember, you must reclaim yourself. But how? Kasha cried out, her voice echoing in the vast space. How can I fight the bond? How can I remember? How can I reclaim myself? The forest, Elsie's voice whispered. The heart of the woods, the ancient tree, the source of the power. Kasha understood. The Oak King, the first guardian, the element of earth. The forest was the key. The heart of the woods, the ancient tree, held the answers, the power, the truth. She had to go back. She had to confront the Oak King again. She had to find a way to undo the bond, or, at least, to renegotiate its terms. She left the chapel, walking out into the cool night air. She walked towards the forest, towards the whispering woods, towards the heart of the woods. She didn't know what she would find there, what challenges she would face, what sacrifices she would have to make. But she was determined. She would fight for her memories, for her independence, for her identity. She would fight for herself. She entered the forest, the trees welcoming her with a rustling whisper, a chorus of ancient voices that seemed to guide her, to protect her, to empower her. She walked deeper and deeper into the woods, following a path she didn't recognize, a path that seemed to be created for her by the forest itself. She walked until she reached a clearing, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. And in the center of the clearing stood the Oak King. It was even more magnificent than she remembered, its branches reaching up to the sky like the arms of a giant, its roots burrowing deep into the earth, anchoring it to the very core of the forest. Kasha approached the tree, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to say, what to do, how to begin. She felt naked, vulnerable, alone, even though the presence of the ancient tree and the forest itself was almost overwhelming. She took a deep breath and waited. Chapter 16. Revelations in the Ancient Cathedral. Kasha stood before the Oak King, the silence of the clearing amplifying the turmoil within her. The massive tree pulsed with an ancient energy, a presence that was both intimidating and strangely comforting. She felt a connection to it, a deep resonance that stemmed from the element of earth she had obtained, from her winter blood, from the bond. She waited, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She didn't know what to expect, what the Oak King would say, what power it would wield. And then it spoke. Not with words, not with a voice that could be heard with human ears, but with a feeling, a sensation, a knowing. It was a wave of sadness, a deep, profound sadness that washed over Kasha, filling her with a sense of loss, of grief, of regret. It was the sadness of the forest, of the land, of the bond. It was the sadness of centuries of struggle, of sacrifice, of betrayal. And it was the sadness of Rhys. Kasha gasped, her eyes widening in understanding. The Oak King was showing her Rhys's perspective, Rhys's memories, Rhys's truth. She saw images. Fleeting, fragmented, but powerful. She saw Rhys as a young wolf, running through the forest, free and wild, his golden eyes shining with joy and innocence. She saw him meeting Alara Winter, the great-great-grandmother whose journal Kasha had read, the woman who had solidified the bond. She saw their love, a deep, passionate love that transcended the boundaries of species, of worlds, of time. But she also saw their struggle, the opposition they faced, the sacrifices they made, the price they paid. She saw the betrayal of Shadowclaw, the rival clan, the ones who sought to break the bond, to twist its power to their own dark purposes. She saw Alara dying, sacrificing herself to protect Rhys, to protect the bond, to protect Hollow Creek. And she saw Rhys alone, devastated by loss, burdened by responsibility, carrying the weight of the bond, of the curse, for centuries. Kasha felt a surge of empathy, a deep, profound understanding of Rhys's pain, his loneliness, his desperation. She understood now why he had been so eager to complete the bond with her, why he had been so reluctant to reveal the true price. He hadn't been trying to deceive her, he had been trying to protect her. He had been trying to spare her the pain, the loss, the grief that he had endured for so long. He had been trying to love her. The images faded, the sadness receding, replaced by a question that resonated deep within Kasha's soul. What will you do? The Oak King was asking her, not just about the bond, not just about Hollow Creek, not just about Rhys. It was asking her about herself. What did she want? What did she believe? What was she willing to sacrifice? Kasha closed her eyes, searching for the answers within herself. She thought of her life before Hollow Creek, her independence, her dreams. She thought of Elsie, of her quiet strength, of her final wish. She thought of Rhys, of his golden eyes, of his love. And she thought of the bond, of the power it held, of the responsibility it entailed. She realized that she had been so focused on what she had lost, on the sacrifice she had made, that she had forgotten what she had gained. She had gained a connection to something ancient, something powerful, something magical. She had gained a purpose. She had gained a love. She had gained Rhys. She opened her eyes, looking at the Oak King, her gaze firm, her voice clear. I will not undo the bond, she said, but I will renegotiate it. She would not lose herself completely. She would find a way to maintain her individuality, her memories, her essence. But she would also embrace the bond, the power, the love. She would find a way to balance the two. The Oak King responded not with words, but with a feeling, a sensation of approval, a blessing. A single, golden leaf, even brighter than the first, detached itself from a branch and floated down, landing gently in Kasha's outstretched hand. It was a symbol of renewal, of hope, of a new beginning. Kasha left the clearing, walking back towards the town, her heart filled with a newfound resolve. She knew the path ahead would not be easy. She would have to confront Rhys, to share her truth, to renegotiate the terms of the bond. But she was not alone. She had the power of the Oak King, the power of the elements, the power of the bond. And she had the power of love. She reached the edge of the forest and saw him, Rhys, waiting for her. The wind carried not only the scent of the woods, but his own unique scent. Her heart, both hers and his, ached. Chapter 17. The Blood Moon's Ascent. Rhys stood at the edge of the forest, his figure silhouetted against the rising moon, a blood-red orb hanging heavy in the sky. He had sensed her return, felt the shift in her energy, the resolution in her spirit. He had been waiting for her, his heart filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He had felt her anger, her resentment, her sense of loss. He had understood her pain, her confusion, her desire to reclaim herself. He had known that she would go to the Oak King, that she would seek answers, that she would challenge the bond. And he had been afraid. Afraid of losing her, afraid of returning to the loneliness, the burden he had carried for so long. But he had also been hopeful. Hopeful that she would find a way, that she would understand, that she would choose him. As Kasha approached, he saw the golden leaf clutched in her hand, a symbol of renewal, of hope, of a new beginning. He saw the determination in her eyes, the strength in her stance, the love in her heart. He knew that she had changed, that the bond had transformed her. But he also knew that she was still Kasha, the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he had bound himself to. Kasha, he said, his voice a low rumble that carried on the night air. She stopped before him, her gaze meeting his. There was no anger in her eyes now, no resentment, no fear. There was only understanding and love. Reese, she said, her voice clear and strong.
We need to talk.
They walked back to the winter house, the silence between them filled with a different kind of tension now. It was not the tension of unspoken truths, of hidden secrets, of unresolved conflict. It was the tension of anticipation, of negotiation, of hope. Inside the house, Kasha placed the golden leaf on the kitchen table, beside the other elements, the shimmering feather, the empty vial. They seemed to pulse with a faint, ethereal light, a symbol of the power they held, the bond they represented. I went to the Oak King, Kasha said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. I saw your memories, your past, your love for Alara. Reese nodded, his golden eyes filled with a deep sadness, a sadness that Kasha now shared. I should have told you, he said. I should have been honest with you. About everything. I understand why you didn't, Kasha said. You were trying to protect me. But it's not your burden to bear alone anymore. It's ours. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I will not undo the bond, Reese, she said. But I will not lose myself completely. We need to find a way to balance it, to maintain our individuality, while still being connected. Reese looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty.
How?
He asked. How can we change the bond? It's ancient. It's immutable. Kasha smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a shiver down his spine. It's not immutable, she said. It's alive. It's evolving. And we're part of it. We can shape it. We can redefine it. She reached out, taking his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. She felt the surge of power, the connection, the love. We need to reperform the ritual, she said. But this time, we do it differently. We do it with intention, with awareness, with love. She looked at the elements on the table, at the golden leaf, the shimmering feather, the empty vial. We have the earth, the air, the memory of moonlight, she said. But we're missing something. Reese understood. Fire, he said. We need the element of fire. But the firestone, it's gone. Destroyed.
Kasha shook her head.
Not destroyed, she said. Transformed. The firestone was just a conduit. The true source of the fire is within us. Within the bond. She looked at him, her eyes glowing with an intensity that mirrored his own. We are the fire, Reese, she said. Our love, our passion, our will. That's the missing element. As the blood moon climbed higher, bathing the room in its crimson light, they knew they had very little time. Tonight, they would redefine everything. Chapter 18. A Choice Between Worlds. The blood moon cast an eerie, crimson glow over Hollow Creek, its light filtering through the windows of the winter house, painting the room in shades of red and shadow. The air was thick with anticipation, with the sense of a turning point, a moment of decision. Kasha and Reese stood before the kitchen table, the elements arrayed before them. The golden leaf, the shimmering feather, the empty vial, and themselves. They were the missing element, the fire, the passion, the love that would complete the ritual, redefine the bond, and shape their future. Are you ready? Reese asked, his voice a low rumble that resonated deep within her. It was his voice, but it also felt like her own. Kasha nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She was afraid, yes, but she was also excited. Excited to embrace her destiny, to create a new future, to redefine the bond on their own terms. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong. I'm ready. They joined hands, their fingers intertwining, their palms pressing together. They felt the surge of power, the connection, the love. It was a different kind of power now, not just the raw, untamed energy of the original bond, but a refined, balanced, harmonious force. They closed their eyes, focusing their will, their intention, their love. They visualized the bond, the ancient connection between the Winters and Hollowfang, the pact that had protected Hollow Creek for centuries. They saw it as a living thing, a flowing river of energy, a tapestry of light and shadow, a dance of two souls. And they saw the imbalance. The way the bond had overwhelmed Kasha, suppressed her individuality, blurred her memories. They focused on correcting that imbalance, on creating a space for both of them, a way to maintain their separate identities while still being connected. They spoke, their voices blending together, a harmonious chorus of intention and will. We are Kasha Winter, Kasha said, her voice filled with strength and determination. And Reese of Hollowfang, Reese said, his voice resonating with power and love. We are two souls, they said together, bound by love, by destiny, by choice. We choose to maintain our individuality, Kasha said, our memories, our dreams. We choose to share our strength, Reese said, our courage, our love. We choose to be one, they said together, but also two. Connected, but free. Bound, but unbroken. As they spoke, the elements on the table began to glow brighter, pulsing with an intense, ethereal light. The golden leaf shimmered, the feather danced, the empty vial filled with a fiery glow, a reflection of their own passion. The air in the room crackled with energy. The blood moon seemed to press closer, its crimson light intensifying, bathing them in its power. Kasha felt a shift, a change within herself, within Reese, within the bond. She felt her memories returning, clearer, stronger, more vivid. She remembered her life before Hollow Creek, her childhood, her career, her dreams. But she also remembered her time in Hollow Creek, her connection to Reese, her embrace of her destiny. She was both Kasha Winter, the woman she had been, and Kasha Winter Hollowfang, the woman she had become. She was whole. She opened her eyes, looking at Reese. He was different. His golden eyes still shone with power, but there was a softness there, a vulnerability that she had not seen before. He was still Reese of Hollowfang, the ancient protector, the werewolf. But he was also her Reese, her partner, her lover, her soulmate. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. It worked, he said, his voice filled with relief and joy. We did it. They had redefined the bond. They had created a new balance. They had chosen their future. But at that moment, they both sensed it. A tremor, a wrongness in the air that even their newly balanced bond couldn't mask. Someone was coming. Chapter 19. The Unraveling of Destiny. The tremor grew into a violent shaking, the house groaning under a force that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath them. The elements on the table, the leaf, the feather, the vial pulsed erratically, their light flickering and dimming, reflecting the disruption in the balance they had just so painstakingly achieved. What is it? Kasha asked, her voice laced with alarm, though a part of her, the part connected to Reese, already knew. Shadowclaw, Reese said, his voice grim, his golden eyes hardening with a familiar, ancient anger. But different. Stronger. It couldn't be the Shadowclaw. They had seen him consumed by the Flameborn. This was something else. Something worse. They rushed outside, the blood moon casting long, distorted shadows across the landscape. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, a chilling presence that made the hairs on Kasha's arms stand on end. And then they saw it. Not a single figure, but a horde. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of werewolves, their eyes glowing with a malevolent, crimson light, their bodies distorted and grotesque, their snarls and growls echoing through the night. They were unlike any werewolves Kasha had seen before, even in her dreams, even in Reese's memories. They were corrupted, twisted, consumed by a dark, destructive power. And leading them, standing at the forefront of the horde, was a figure that sent a chill of pure terror down Kasha's spine. It was a woman, tall and imposing, her body clad in black leather armor, her face hidden behind a mask of bone, similar to the one worn by the Shadowclaw they had defeated. But her eyes were different. They were not the cold, cruel eyes of the previous Shadowclaw. They were familiar. Hauntingly familiar. They were Elsie's eyes. Kasha gasped, her mind reeling, her heart pounding in her chest.
It couldn't be.
It was impossible. Grandmother? She whispered, her voice barely audible above the growls of the approaching horde. The woman smiled, a cruel, mocking smile that twisted her features into a grotesque parody of Elsie's kind, gentle face. Not quite, child, she said, her voice a distorted echo of Elsie's, laced with a cold, malevolent power. But close. I am a part of her. A part she rejected. A part she hid. She raised her hand, and the horde of werewolves surged forward, their eyes fixed on Kasha and Reese, their claws and fangs bared, their intent unmistakable. The bond is not complete, the woman said, her voice rising above the din of the approaching wolves. It is weak, vulnerable, and I will break it. Reese roared, a primal sound that shook the very ground beneath them, a challenge to the woman, a defiance of her power. He shifted, his body transforming, his fur growing thicker, his claws extending, his fangs bared.
He was ready to fight.
To protect Kasha. To protect Hollow Creek. To protect the bond. But Kasha was frozen. Paralyzed by fear, by disbelief, by the horror of seeing her grandmother's face twisted into such a monstrous form. Elsie, why? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. Why are you doing this? The woman laughed, a cold, cruel sound that echoed through the night. Because she was weak, she said. She denied her true power. She embraced the ordinary. She betrayed her heritage. She looked at Kasha, her eyes filled with a burning hatred. But you're different. You have the power. You have the potential. And I will take it. She lunged forward, her claws extended, her intent clear. She was going to kill Kasha. To steal her power. To break the bond. Reese moved to intercept her, to protect Kasha, but he was too slow. The horde of werewolves was upon them, overwhelming him, holding him back, preventing him from reaching her. Kasha closed her eyes, bracing herself for the impact. For the end. This was how it ended, then. The destiny unraveled. By the very person she'd come back to honor. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts. But the impact never came. Kasha opened her eyes, blinking in confusion.
She was not dead.
She was not injured. She was protected. Standing before her, shielding her from the woman who wore Elsie's face, was Reese. Not the partially shifted Reese, the werewolf warrior, but Reese in his full form. The magnificent, moonlit wolf of her dreams. He was larger than she had imagined, his fur shimmering in the blood moon's light, his emerald eyes burning with a fierce, protective intensity. He stood between Kasha and the corrupted Elsie, his body a living shield, his growl a low, rumbling threat that resonated deep within her bones. The sight of him, in his true form, filled Kasha with a surge of strength, of courage, of love. She was not alone. She had Reese. And she had the bond. The corrupted Elsie snarled, her eyes fixed on Reese, her claws flexing in anticipation. You cannot stop me, Hollowfang, she said, her voice a distorted echo of Elsie's, laced with hatred and power. The bond is weak. It will break. Reese responded, not with words, but with a roar. A roar that shook the very foundations of Hollow Creek, a roar that echoed through the night, a roar that challenged the corrupted Elsie, defied her power, and affirmed the bond. The roar was not just a sound, it was a force. A wave of energy that emanated from Rhys, pushing back the horde of corrupted werewolves, creating a space around him and Kasha, a sanctuary in the midst of the chaos. Kasha felt the power of the bond surging within her, stronger than ever before, amplified by Rhys's presence, by his love, by his sacrifice. She reached out, touching Rhys's fur, her fingers sinking into its soft, warm depths. She felt a connection to him, a deep, profound connection that transcended words, that transcended form. She was Kasha Winter Hollowfang, and she would not be defeated. She looked at the corrupted Elsie, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. "You are not my grandmother," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with the power of the bond. "You are a shadow, a reflection of her fears, her regrets, her unfulfilled potential." She raised her hand, focusing her will, her intention, her love. She drew upon the power of the elements, the power of the bond, the power of herself. "I release you," she said, her voice echoing through the night. "I release you from your anger, your hatred, your pain. I release you from Hollow Creek." A wave of energy emanated from Kasha, a pure, white light that enveloped the corrupted Elsie, pushing back the darkness, dissolving the corruption. The woman screamed, a high-pitched, agonizing scream that was a mixture of Elsie's voice and something else. Something inhuman. The scream faded, the light subsided, and the woman collapsed. She was no longer wearing the mask of bone. Her face was no longer distorted. Her eyes were no longer filled with hatred. She was Elsie, but she was not the Elsie Kasha remembered. She was younger, stronger. Her eyes were filled with a peaceful light, a gentle serenity that Kasha had never seen before. "Kasha," Elsie said, her voice soft and clear, her gaze filled with love. "Thank you." She smiled, a beautiful, radiant smile that warmed Kasha's heart. And then she faded. She was gone. The horde of corrupted werewolves, no longer under the woman's control, dispersed, disappearing into the forest, their snarls and growls fading into the night. Rhys shifted back, his body returning to its human form, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. He took Kasha's hand, his grip firm, reassuring. "It's over," he said, his voice a low rumble that resonated deep within her. "It's finally over." Kasha nodded, tears streaming down her face, tears of grief, of relief, of love. They stood there, hand in hand, under the blood moon, the silence broken only by the gentle rustling of the trees, the distant hooting of an owl, the whispers of the wind. The bond was strong. The balance was restored. Hollow Creek was safe. And Kasha was free. Free to be herself. Free to be with Rhys. Free to live. The blood moon began to wane, its crimson light fading, replaced by the soft, gentle glow of the dawn. A new day was beginning. A new chapter. Epilogue. Years passed. The seasons turned, painting Hollow Creek in a continuous cycle of vibrant life and quiet dormancy. The frozen river flowed freely again, its waters reflecting the changing sky, the whispering trees, the peace that had settled over the land. Kasha and Rhys lived in the winter house, its walls filled with the echoes of laughter, of shared stories, of a love that had endured the trials of time and the challenges of destiny. The house, once a mausoleum of memories, was now a vibrant home, filled with the warmth of the hearth, the scent of baking bread, and the presence of two souls, intertwined but distinct. The bond remained, a strong, unwavering connection between them, a source of power, of comfort, of love. But it was a different kind of bond now, a balanced bond, a harmonious bond, a bond that allowed them to be both one and two. Connected, but free. Bound, but unbroken. Kasha's memories had returned, fully, vividly, her life before Hollow Creek restored, integrated with her new reality, her new identity. She was Kasha Winter, yes, but she was also Kasha Winter Hollowfang, a woman who had embraced her heritage, her destiny, her love. She often walked in the forest, visiting the Oak King, the ancient tree that had guided her, that had shown her Reese's truth, that had helped her find her own. She would sit beneath its branches, feeling its presence, its wisdom, its peace. Reese, too, had changed. The centuries of loneliness, of burden, of regret, had faded, replaced by a newfound joy, a lightness of spirit, a love that filled his golden eyes with a warmth that melted Kasha's heart every time she saw it. He still protected Hollow Creek, still guarded the Vale, still embraced his role as Hollowfang. But he did it with Kasha by his side, their combined strength, their shared love, making them a force that was unbreakable. They had children. Children who inherited the blood of the Winters and the spirit of Hollowfang. Children who grew up surrounded by magic, by love, by the whispers of the ancient trees. The children were taught the history of Hollow Creek, the story of the bond, the sacrifices that had been made, the love that had endured. They were taught to respect the land, to honor the elements, to protect the balance. And they were taught to choose their own paths, to create their own destinies, to forge their own bonds. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Kasha and Reese stood on the porch of the Winter house, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Kasha leaned against Reese, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand in his. She felt the warmth of his body, the strength of his presence, the love that flowed between them. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft and filled with contentment. Reese nodded, his golden eyes reflecting the setting sun, his arm tightening around her. "Yes," he said. "It is." They stood there in silence for a long moment, simply being together, connected, free. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke, of pine needles, of home. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Kasha knew that she had found everything she had ever wanted, everything she had ever needed, right here, in Hollow Creek, with Reese, in the embrace of the bond. It was a love story, a story of magic, of sacrifice, of destiny. But most of all, it was a story of choice, of choosing love, of choosing connection, of choosing freedom. And it was a story that would continue, for generations to come, whispered on the wind, carried by the river, rooted in the heart of Hollow Creek. The final, golden light of the sunset faded. Night had truly fallen. But in the Winter house, and in the town of Hollow Creek, a different kind of light, a light of enduring love and hard-won peace shone brightly.